right, I think we'll kick it off. We still have some people trickling in, but if they get in, they'll be here. All right, just quick housekeeping, kick it off. If anyone has any trouble with audio, let us know in the chat or QA. This will be recorded. So if you have to drop off somewhere in the middle of today, don't worry, we're gonna record this and email it out to you. But if you do stick around, we'll be covering live Q&A all throughout today's live stream and at the end. So definitely make sure you stick around for that if you can. And I don't think there's any more. Oh, the other thing is if you do have a question, please put it into Q&A. It's a lot easier for us to track and we'll make sure we get to it rather than putting it in the chat. So if you do have a question, make sure it's in the Q&A. All right, without further ado, I think I'm gonna kick it off. Today we have joined by Mark, Jim, and Grayson, who are gonna give us an intro on the next slide here. But we are excited to welcome Penn State and Mediacurrent on for this week's live stream.
Hi, my name is Jim Norris, and I'm responsible for web product and technical strategy in the Office of Strategic Communications at Penn State.
Hey, I'm Grayson Hicks. I'm a software engineer here at Gatsby. I work primarily with our enterprise level customers, helping them solve problems and optimize things with Gatsby.
All right, and my name is Mark Shropshire. I'm a senior director of development at Mediacurrent, full service digital agency who worked on this project, and we are ready to dive in, everybody. So I want to kind of cover a little on the agenda for today. We're going to just mention briefly some of our focus on higher ed from a Mediacurrent stance. Then we're going to jump into opportunities facing Penn State news, those opportunities that we all talked about at the beginning of this project a little over 2 years ago. Then we'll dive into what needed to be done, how we primed this project for publishing, and then some technical dives into the Penn State platform that's been built. And of course, as Dan mentioned, we'll dive into some Q&A after that. So kicking off a little bit here, one thing that I've been really excited about on this project is really the partnership between Gatsby and Mediacurrent. We are really focused at Mediacurrent on open source. We value that. Gatsby does as well. But I just love the fact that we've been able to leverage this project to make that integration between Gatsby and Drupal even better. The scale of this project has allowed us to improve Gatsby and Drupal and the open source code involved, and it'll benefit everybody in the community from there on out. And that's the beauty of open source.
Yeah, so I'm not sure who here is from more of the JavaScript world or the Drupal world, or maybe even the higher ed world, but to give you a quick intro to Gatsby, Gatsby is an open source React-based web framework. Traditionally known for static site generation, now it offers traditional server-side rendering, a really cool rendering mode called deferred static generation. And really one of the coolest things about Gatsby is its decoupled GraphQL data layer. So it lets you bring data from anywhere. In this case, it's bringing it from Drupal, but it can come from really any source. It's got a plugin API and a plugin ecosystem, so you can write your own source plugins. And then all that data feels like and looks like it's coming from one GraphQL source as opposed to maybe 6 different places. And then of course, this site is built and launched on Gatsby Cloud, which is like the best place for building and hosting and doing things like preview, which we'll get into. So yeah, that's Gatsby.
All right. So just a bit on Mediacurrent's focus on higher education. We're real excited to partner with Penn State University on the project we're talking about today. And we also have experience with many other higher ed institutions. These are just a few of those names that we wanted to mention. So happy to talk more about that after the call if anybody wants to. So now we'll jump into the opportunities facing Penn State.
Okay, so I want to briefly set the stage for the other engineers on this call to talk about how our goals and strategies were addressed in this project, but I want to paint a picture of the of the business situation we're in and the problems that we were facing. And even before that, I just want to mention that I represent a team of Penn State strategists and designers and developers and functional owners and DevOps engineers not here, and it's an honor to represent all of their work. So our legacy system, we had a highly customized and highly integrated Drupal 7 site. It was at a very large scale, 100,000 or so sort of public stories and many, many, many more hundreds of thousands of ancillary assets. We've had that since 2013. And 2 years ago or so, we took advantage of the D7 end of life announcement to reassess really everything. And so we initiated an in-house total rediscovery of our functional, our technical, and our strategic requirements. And we discovered that what we really needed was more than just a news website. What we needed was a dynamic digital and strategy empowering platform that was built presuming that our priorities are always shifting and that we needed to adapt quickly. And the opportunity to transform was to transform this news website into a flagship content hub for Penn State and a standard for how Penn State websites should be built and maintained going forward. So the business situation is functionally Penn State we operate in a highly decentralized public relations and communication situation. So we are a large institution. We have many campuses, over 20 campuses, many major departments and units, and they all have their own distinct websites. They all have their own distinct communication and marketing operations. So technically, there's dozens of integration partners and websites that are hitting the legacy website and needed to hit the new website. Our backend, our old Drupal backend, was the central editorial workflow and approval business system of record for our news and public relations editorial office. So it was more than just a CMS. It really was a business system powering our PR business. And the front end is the news and PR publications of record and generator of millions of annual email blasts. And what we found is that we had years and years of accumulated technical debt that was bound to this D7 Drupal monolith. Loads of up and downstream dependencies. It was becoming fragile. It was becoming expensive. It was hosted on premises, and it was nearing end of life. So a little bit more color around the scale of scope of what we're doing here. I mean, this is a really big website. We have about 250 authors around the Commonwealth. That comprises of 24 or so campuses, and then approximately all combined 50 colleges and major departments and units that again have their own distinct workflows and their own distinct communications offices. And they're all and the system has multiple content types. See, the legacy system had thousands of taxonomies, each with a distinct RSS feed. It was hosted on premises with an A10 varnish array. It had been a multi-site shared with PSU.edu. PSU.edu had been set as the child. I like to say it was like towing a jet ski from the back of a battleship. PSU.edu. It had 85 or so pages and needed to adapt very, very quickly. News is built for scale and stability. So one of our first things was to break them apart and to handle in their own workflows. We used to integrate with Flickr, about 65,000 images. We used to integrate with a faculty tenure tracking software. And this was all bound to a single Git flow. And I should make it clear that I'm not sitting in a central IT unit. We're a communications unit. This is a lot of technical debt for a small comms unit to be handling. So the legacy system, our downstream partnering websites and systems, they're integrating so that they can reuse content. So we use a JSON API for literally syncing nodes and assets to some of our partnering campuses, and then RSS sort of per taxonomies for our partnering websites. And then we integrate with this old school listserv that is the system of record for our email blast. So we had this epiphany, we already were operating as a content hub, but we had no formal strategy around that. So we just needed to start building towards, Penn State reusable content hub as a service, right, as a strategic goal. And that meant, universal API standard as a foundation for the platform going forward. And we needed to deliver this content agnostic to platform. Penn State, there's a lot of Drupal here, but there's a lot of everything here. So we cannot presume Penn State, Drupal, excuse me, at Penn State is the consuming platform, right? And we're also delivering IA in the API too. There's a lot of our taxonomies are used, a lot of these taxonomies are being used differently per consuming partner. So in conclusion, right, it's more than just a website that we're building here. Our discovery determined the following needs. We needed to streamline this product. We need to jettison a lot of unneeded bolt-ons and then go to market with a clean and clear product vision. And that included, we need to host in the cloud, reduce our system administration and our overhead costs. We needed to power Penn State developers to own the front end. So that meant separate the front end from the back end workflow. We needed to establish a Penn State standard for front end coding. We wanted to onboard atomic component design principles and establish a standard for the Penn State brand on the web. So we're talking here about introducing a design system and pattern library that's powering the new site, but it's a flag in the ground for a design system that can scale up to more use cases. We needed to enable novel digital and SEO strategies. We needed to prune a lot of content. We needed to reslug at migration. We needed to move from a subdomain, news.psu.edu, to psu.edu/news. And we needed to reduce content bloat, meaning to us, archiving means we're going to publish this article, but we want to hide it from search engines, right? So, and we also needed instant alerts as a service, real-time alerting, both that could be syndicated across platforms. We needed a content API as a content hub service. We needed pixel perfect preview. We needed an improved authoring experience based on customized workflow and the unique business culture. And we needed to migrate all this and refactor this platform and do all of the above without disrupting any of our routine operations. So we had this epiphany. We might be a good use case for decoupled. I think we knew that, but could it be done at scale and at a predictable cost?
All right. That was a great intro, Jim. And we're going to jump right into what needed to be done from there. So as far as the site requirements that we had along the way, outsourcing of hosting, Jim mentioned that, really being able to predict cost and have less focus on infrastructure and let Penn State worry about the business needs that they have was a great goal and a requirement that we had along the way. Again, that best-in-class Drupal content authoring experience is really key to Penn State's success for this project. From content moderation workflows through easy-to-use content entry, it's all really important. It's something that we launched with and we think is a success out of the gate, but we have more improvements and we'll continue to go from there. And of course, a fully decoupled front end, and that's a lot of why we're talking today on this Gatsby webinar, is really to focus in on like how that all works. But that's a requirement, and it has a lot of reasons we'll dig into a little more later. But some of those include security and performance, but also even recruiting development teams that have React experience and Gatsby experience. But there's more to come on the fully decoupled part. Drupal is a content hub here, and we have a lot of APIs coming from the Drupal site. So allowing Gatsby and Penn State campuses and more to access those data via APIs is really critical. Those are things that will be improved. We've already got requests from other campus departments who have needs for other API improvements. And then development workflows. this is really a key part here, being able to allow developers to work separately from front end to back end in those Git repos. And, here's a great example. We were able to release a Drupal release just last week. At the same time, we didn't have to do anything on the front end. Gatsby just sat there and, well, Gatsby didn't even know. Gatsby Cloud wasn't even aware there's a Drupal release, but we were able to do that, and everything just kept humming right along. And that was great. So being able to separate those teams out, they still work together, but they can work independently and have releases on the same day, different days, whenever is needed. But that independence of working with developers is really great. Okay, so a little bit about creating a storytelling system, because that's ultimately what this is about. I mean, it's fun to talk tech, it's fun to talk about all these things, but in the end, this is about getting the stories out to the people who need to read them. So, so some key pieces here is it's critical to have design systems that allow the most flexibility when using modern web technologies such as React. Those are a key piece, and having that flexible design so that it works better for users to consume. And so we have a Storybook Living Style Guide that's really key to this. And Storybook is what's used. It provides a focused component level view of the site's design. And this is just fantastic because it allows us to reuse existing components. We can go through that library of components and let's say there's a new feature request. We can say, oh, wait a minute, we have a component that's really close. Let's just use that again. Or how can we use that? But we can also, at a component level, test browsers and test for accessibility, which I think is fantastic. We don't have to rely just on the full page views. We can do that at a component level. And the goal is to not let anything get in the way of users accessing the latest news at Penn State. I mean, ultimately, that's the important thing here. So all of these things have to work in conjunction.
Thanks, Drop. So that's a lot of Drupal talk. And again, depending on what kind of attendee you are here, that may not have made like a whole lot of sense to your, what you do day to day. So I want to talk a little bit about the Gatsby aspect here. So Gatsby is, I don't think you could find a framework more built for like this situation that Trop and Jim are talking about, which is Gatsby wants to source data from wherever you have that data, right? So then all that data gets put into this uniform GraphQL schema. And from that point forward, besides the name of the data, it all looks and feels the same. But let me take a step back because we're going to get into some performance stuff in a second. So Gatsby as a framework is really a performance first framework. So if you go look at Google's framework numbers that measure real user data, right? So if you ever opt into data sharing with Google and you land on a page, it will send the core web vitals back to Google, and those get tallied up and the page gets a score. And they can also track what framework that created that page, even if it's like PHP or whatever. They have thousands of them, right? Gatsby is consistently the highest React-based framework for performance, hands down. And there's a lot of built-in features that help you do that. There's Gatsby Link, there's Gatsby Image, it's prefetching a page before you've even clicked on it. It's already there. So performance is super, super important in this whole discussion. But then, so back to the content mesh. So the idea is that Gatsby has a plugin architecture, right? A plugin ecosystem. And in this case, it leaned heavily on Drupal, but you could imagine the same site, Penn State one day saying, you know what, we're exploring Contentful and we've got this Contentful instance over here. And it's super important that we're able to bring this data into the site or into another site. And again, Gatsby can source data from any of these sources. And when you're the front end developer and it's time to wire up a React component to the data, you don't have to write a bunch of like fetches and network requests and have to remember, oh, how does the Contentful API work? Or let me look at the Drupal JSON API docs because I got to do a filter and it has to have this special pattern, or you don't have to worry about any of that. Like it just sources all the data for you in a uniform way. And then kind of the last piece of this puzzle is Gatsby Cloud, right? So Gatsby has open source incremental builds which is a monumental release that makes it where when you rebuild something, it should only rebuild what has changed, what needs to be rebuilt. So even on code changes, you have really amazing caching strategies where if you merge a PR, you're not going to see the same rebuild time as you might have seen from your initial build, and then data updates as well. So then Gatsby Cloud puts kind of another layer on top of that where it handles data updates really intelligently. So it says, okay, this is a data update from Drupal. I'm gonna process this in an even more unique and efficient way so that this data update, only takes a few seconds as opposed to, maybe a few more seconds with the open source version. And then of course, pre-incremental builds, it would have been much, much longer. So that's kind of the three main parts of how Gatsby is benefiting this PSU site here.
All right, that's great, Grayson. You summed it up fantastically there. And so let's talk a little bit about how the system now is primed for publishing on top of all the things we've already talked about a bit.
So preview. So I mentioned a second ago incremental builds, but Gatsby Preview has been around before incremental builds. So let's take even one more step back and say, well, what is preview, right? So you've heard the word decoupled thrown around here a few times. You might have heard the word headless. So the idea is that you're taking these CMSs that are normally full stack. They normally have their own like templating language and way to do front end things and see the UI. But you're kind of pushing that to the side and saying, I'm going to let something else do that. You're just going to be my content management system, like literally just managing my content, right? So one problem with that is the full stack CMSs, the UI and the data are built to work together. So you would often be able to look at the content, make a change and see the content, in another window or in a panel or something. And that was just built into the CMS and you didn't really have to think about it, right? But when you go headless, the CMS may not know where that data is ending up. And so it doesn't necessarily have a strategy for being able to get that into a UI where your editors can see what's going on, right? So any kind of React framework or even non-React, any kind of JavaScript framework has to solve this problem, right? So Gatsby Preview has been around for a while, but it's been through a couple iterations. The first iteration was a long-running develop process. So you would run Gatsby develop just like you were on your local. You'd maybe have a special endpoint setting, I believe, that was listening for changes in your CMS, and then it would basically do a hot reload, just like if you were to edit the file in your VS Code or something, right? Long term, that was problematic. Having a process running for a really long time, you have slightly different behaviors between the developed version of Gatsby and a production build, like minifying JavaScript, right? Things were running super slow because in develop, you don't do some of those things. But with incremental builds, it unlocked a new generation of preview. So now Gatsby Preview is powered by incremental builds underneath the hood. So it knows when it gets data. Drupal sends the data, the webhook in a certain shape and says, hey, here's what's changed. Gatsby takes that, says, okay, let me only rerun the pages that have changed, right? So there's even, Drupal has a Gatsby module, right? That puts a preview button there. Other CMSs have a similar thing, right? Like the Gatsby app that's built in and integrated with preview. So that's kind of the idea, is that your content editor should be able to make changes and in very near real time, see those changes as they would actually exist on the production site.
Awesome. Yeah, that's the Gatsby preview is just huge. We'll even talk a bit more about it a little later, and happy to answer questions about it. I think that's a real exciting piece of this project. I did want to mention a little bit about image optimization. Drupal will allow you to upload the original source images. And of course, imagery and files are real important, especially the images for a news site like Penn State News. And this is an example where the content authors can upload those original images. They're saved out to Amazon S3. And when a request comes in for the image, Drupal handles generating the derivatives for those images. So all of the proper sizing and image styles, and that's what Drupal calls them, image styles that are needed. Those are handled then in source set. on the front end properly by Gatsby. But all those derivatives are then stored in S3, which has been really a great place for performance. And it's critical to telling the stories on the Penn State news site to be able to have those images load up quickly and efficiently and at the right sizes for mobile and desktop and more. So I want to speak a little bit about groups and roles and how that works on the content authoring side. This is on the Drupal side of things, but definitely affects things like the front end, like making sure that the stories are properly published with the right content and have gone through the editorial process that's required. So content authoring at a scale such as Penn State News requires just a robust system to handle, 250 plus content contributors with all kinds of different access through that editorial process. An interesting thing about Drupal, if you're not familiar, it comes out of the box with the ability to handle users, permissions, and roles. This is a long time benefit of Drupal because we don't have to write as developers any type of code to handle those types of functions, including content moderation, which comes out of the box. But we can use custom code to modify how those things work. So we like to think of Drupal as a content management framework that you can actually install modules to get you along the way and then customize from there. So all of those Drupal features around groups and roles, they can be enhanced by custom code, and we have done that on this project. I would just say content moderation has been really critical along the way through this project, as it does guide that editorial workflow. So we did talk a bit. I did mention on decoupled a little bit about security and how this is obviously critical to any project these days, but decoupled has some advantages here. So just a bit about the Drupal side. We do Mediacurrent maintain the Garter distribution, and that is part of the Penn State build. So we do have a lot of extra security hardening provided by Garter with Drupal. And we also have integrated SAML authentication with Penn State's Azure Active Directory. And that is really a huge benefit, as you might imagine, having single sign-on that allows users to not have to worry about changing passwords, maintaining accounts, and things like that. In Drupal, that's all handled for them using their Penn State credentials, and it also improves security. If a user left Penn State or something like that, it's all managed centrally. So there's key benefits there. But on the decoupled front end, I think it's really fantastic. Static site security benefits are numerous, but just having that separation, I think, between the front end and back end of the content authoring system is really key. So currently on the front end of this site, the site that you actually see at psu.edu/news, there is not a place to log in. There's not any kind of authentication there, so we don't have to worry about that. It's generally, most of the site is completely static, and that provides that separation, provides quite a bit of security, and we can keep the Drupal site available just to the teams that actually need it. And anyway, there's more to security on that, but we will jump on to some next steps here and talk about the Penn State platform, which I promised we would dive more into, even more technical here than we already have talked about. So back to impacts of decoupling. Here's an expanded list of some of those items. And when it comes to decoupling, I think decoupling can make sense in a lot of ways for higher education in general. When you look at the user experience, being able to deliver Penn State news and with a very modern front-end framework like Gatsby provides, and with Storybook and the component pieces we talked about already, that is really big. And at the same time, being able to still have that Drupal backend that the Penn State editorial team was already familiar with was great along the way too. We don't have to worry about building an entire content authoring system. Drupal handles that, a lot of that piece out of the box, and then the front end can do what we need. But We mentioned earlier a little bit about resourcing and hiring. This allows, from a decoupled standpoint, to focus on hiring teams that just focus on Drupal or just focus on React and Gatsby. There's benefits there. Again, performance. Grayson talked a good bit about performance, which is absolutely huge. And that's something that we've spent a great deal of time on between Mediacurrent, Penn State, and Gatsby to really improve performance overall. And generally just the functionality. Like I like to say, and this is the exciting part for me about Gatsby as a developer, is what Gatsby is today to me is not what it's going to be like a week from now, a month from now, 6 months from now, years from now. Like it is always improving and always changing. So we can look forward to that roadmap and all the things to come. And that partnership has been really fantastic for us. I do want to jump in a little bit to the tech stack here. And I know there's a lot of icons and things going on here, but I'm going to highlight some of the pieces that I think are kind of most important. And so when it comes to that dev experience, you can clearly see here that Drupal and Gatsby both have their own Git repos. That's that part we talked about earlier on in the talk. It's that separation of development workflows. It means we can deploy to each of those separately. Those builds happen completely separately in their own pipeline systems. And whether it's Gatsby Cloud or our open source pipelines used for Drupal. And those are independent. It's really fantastic. The connector between those two, of course, is JSON API. I say, of course, that's obvious to most of us that build Drupal sites because that is built into Drupal core. You just turn on a module and you get JSON API. That is what the Gatsby source plugin uses default. That's what Drupal uses default, and in the Gatsby module, and that's that is that connector. Even though Drupal can use REST APIs and things like that, that is the connector used. We also have some additional API connectors that go to the other campuses. Jim mentioned that earlier, that there's JSON API involved there, but we also have some other endpoints that we use for various support mechanisms. Files and images are stored in AWS. And when we talk about, and I can't forget, it's while we're talking a lot about Gatsby and decoupled, I have to say, like the email system that's used by Penn State News, these emails go out daily. It's amazing to me. And I think it's like 30 million plus emails a year, something like that. It's definitely millions of emails in those blasts. That is huge. That is how people rely on getting those latest top headlines daily in their inboxes, so they can then go view the site. And it's really important to the campus, and something faculty, staff, students receive, and alumni as well. But that's a critical piece. So that is a piece that's important to that user experience. But when we go to the user-facing website and the user experience there, one thing that's just critical about how all this technology is fantastic, but in the end, it's a performant front-end website provided by all these tools involved. The users get these, if you go look at these pages, I mean, that, that prefetching that Grayson mentioned earlier on, stories is just amazing. I mean, I had family and friends that I finally was able to talk about the project with, and they, these are non-technical people, and they're like, wow, this is fast. They couldn't believe how fast it came up, because I guess they're used to seeing sites that are slow. Another feature is the campus alerts, which is driven directly by Drupal and Firebase. That's neat on the user side of things, because a user can be on a Penn State news site, and let's say some important alert has to come out from the campus. As soon as that's published from Drupal, it hits Firebase and it goes out as a WebSocket update directly from Firebase to the top of the page on the Penn State News website. It doesn't have to go through any kind of build with Gatsby, but Gatsby provides the scaffolding basically in the DOM to receive that that change, and the person will then see the alert. And I think that's, from a life safety and just news, that's an important user piece there that's really critical, and we're excited about.
Cool. So I want to start with something that Trop said about how Gatsby's continuously improving. And this project is just such an example of that. I think this project 2 years ago, year and a half ago with Gatsby, either just wouldn't have been possible or wouldn't have had a very good like content editor experience or something like that. Right. But 2021 has been such a massive year for Gatsby. We launched V3. Now we've launched V4, and like I can't even get into all the amazing features that have been unlocked now. I will a little bit, but the coolest thing before I get into the front end stuff particularly is that we've made so many improvements, like working directly with Mediacurrent and PSU, that just go back into open source, right? Like so many of these improvements with Drupal and with Gatsby Core are now available for anyone that's building a Gatsby site or a Gatsby with Drupal site. Like you're reaping such amazing performance improvements the last year, and it's open source end to end, which is like just amazing. But so front end experience, to me, this is a two-part thing, right? There's front end experience, like Shrop just mentioned, your family members, people, your end user. What is their front end experience when they land on your site? And then there's the developer front end experience. So what is it like onboarding somebody? What is it like for somebody to build a new page, right? What is it like to hook up to a new data source, right? So that's the front end like developer experience. So we touched a little bit on how Gatsby has these built-in features. I'll dive in a little bit to something like Gatsby Link. If you're not familiar with Gatsby Link, Gatsby Link uses regular HTML best practices, but in like a dynamic way when it builds anchor tags, right? So basically it takes advantage of React's client-side routing. And so let's say you have a page, you're on the home page and you have a link to the about page, right? Or let's say you have a list of blogs. And so there's a long list of blogs, and every blog is a link to the next blog. As you scroll, Gatsby starts doing a low priority network request for the assets needed for those pages where it sees a link tag, right? So it sees /blog post number 1, it starts very quietly asking for it. Then as you hover over it, it starts aggressively asking for it. So if you're just scrolling, it may abandon those requests, or they're not gonna block anything that's a higher priority in the window that you're in, right? But then once you hover it, it'll say, okay, they're about to click. So then by the time you click, that page is already there, right? The page is already loaded, essentially, and it feels tremendously fast. That's just one of the things. There's so many things. If you've ever built and this is going to start to bleed over into the developer experience, I'd love to know how many people on here built a React site even before Create React App, right? So maybe like 2015, 2016, maybe, if you built a React site. It's hard to overstate how amazing tools like Gatsby are. Back in the day, right, you used to have to set up your own Webpack. If you chose Webpack, you had to do your own Babel. You had to do all of these painful things to get a React site working. And now Gatsby, that's just one part of what it does. It handles the Webpack config for you. It handles the Babel config for you. It's got escape hatches if you need them. But otherwise, you're just in a React ecosystem. So I built, some really cool, if you ever use React 3 Fiber, which is like a 3JS library for React, which is amazing. You can do that with Gatsby. You can do anything in the React ecosystem with Gatsby. Once you're in there, it's just React, right? So as far as developers, hiring resources and just developer experience, you're just writing React code. It's super, super simple. And then again, if you've worked with JSON API, Drupal JSON API outside of React, I find it pretty painful, right? Like writing filters and doing things like pagination and making things really dynamic with JavaScript can be really difficult with some of the more legacy full stack CMSs, right? Like they were built with a different era of JavaScript at the time, right? It was supposed to like just sprinkle in some interactivity, and now you have these JavaScript frameworks. Like JavaScript wants to be the whole page. So Gatsby is much more in that camp. But as far as developer experience, you're able to go in there and build, whatever you like. And then when it comes to getting the data in, like I said, it's straightforward. You've got this Gatsby API for the GraphQL queries and getting the data into the template. It's very interesting if you've familiar with, separation of concerns, it was always like, all right, HTML has to be here, CSS have to be here, JavaScript has to be here, like maybe that pulls in a little data. And now like modern React and Gatsby especially, you've got all of that. Like it's very co-located, right? The separation is still there mentally, but not by files. So you've got your data, your styles, your markup, your interactivity all in one component. So it's reusable, it's fun to work with. So yep. I could go on and on in case you can't tell.
I love Grayson's excitement about it. We do feel it, like all of that, like from a developer experience, we feel it, and I think users perceive it as well. Even if they don't know all the technical pieces, they do see the benefits that happen from all the work that's been done behind the scenes. So we talked a little bit about the content authoring experience, and just to mention a few things here related a little deeper into the Drupal side of things. Again, Drupal has a benefit of having a lot of things baked into core, like content moderation and users, roles, permissions, things like that. On top of that, there are contributed modules that can be added. So when we did integrations for like single sign-on, there is Drupal community modules that provide those. They've to me feel similar to Gatsby plugins. Like if you were to draw some analogies there, you've got to plug in maybe for React Helmet, and there's similar SEO type things on the Drupal side. So real similar. And I think that makes it so you can, on the Drupal content authoring side, you can get down to business very quickly, and you do not have to spend a lot of time writing all the custom code. You can get like 90% there, and maybe that last 10% that you need to customize, you can work on. We did partner, and Penn State had already had a relationship with Acquia. So Acquia is hosting that experience. And so we are fully in the cloud. I think that was a question that was out there as well. So I'll kind of address that here, had it in my notes. So they're also a great partner. So it's, this is, it was needed. That was one of the goals, really, to get all of this out there and hosted in the cloud. And again, taxonomy is really something that's been in Drupal from the very beginning. And near the beginning of Drupal, taxonomy has always been real critical. And it just so happens that taxonomy is used quite a bit for the authoring experience still to this day on the Penn State News site. It's really important to be able to tag, and there's free tagging, and there's specific tags that are generated, and those will automatically generate pages. When you save content in Drupal, it kicks off publishing and incremental builds, and then new pages are built, RSS feeds are generated, and sitemaps are built, and all those things on the front end for making those changes. The thing that I'm like super excited about, as y'all can tell from Grayson and I were talking about it, I think it's a huge step for Drupal to have that pixel perfect preview right there in line. So the Gatsby module being able to show that, what Grayson was talking about earlier, that frame that shows the actual Gatsby site in the preview mode, that's really cool, because you don't really get that out of the box with Drupal. You can get some representation of how layout might look and things like that, but to be able to immediately in a draft in Drupal see that pixel perfect preview, it is really a big step that I think is super important.
So I do want to point out, looks like we're coming close on time, so I might go a little fast here, but so I'll talk mainly about scale here. So I mentioned 2021 being a huge year for Gatsby, and the Gatsby 4 release, was just about a month ago. This is something that PSU is not using yet, but it's really amazing looking at a site like PSU and imagining, I think we've already got on the roadmap a path forward for things like SSR or deferred static generation. So I'll touch on those briefly. SSR is going to be, these are two Gatsby 4 features. So typically it's when you get to scale, when you're building really large sites, really complex sites, with Gatsby, the build time is going to increase, incremental build time would then increase as well. So we now have SSR and deferred static generation. SSR is going to be your typical React SSR. The user lands on a page, the server generates the HTML from the React code and sends it back. Deferred static generation, super original, very cool idea. When the user lands on the page, that page gets statically generated for the first time. And then after that, it's part of the build. So really, really unlocking scale with Gatsby 4 and beyond.
So we did want to mention here just a bit about just that partnership that we had and still have with open source, and Gatsby and Mediacurrent and Penn State have worked really hard together to really improve the open source side of the code base. And again, it just benefits everybody. And right now, actually, just want to mention that we've got a formal partnership with Mediacurrent Gatsby that I'm just excited to speak about just briefly. And that's to really take on ownership of the Gatsby Drupal module and help to maintain that going forward. And so we're really excited to be able to have that focus time on that with Gatsby and to continue to push forward that Drupal and Gatsby integration.
Yeah, so I just touched on this a little bit, but with DSG, so DSG is going to really treat your data as the source of truth and the indicator of when a build needs to take place. So that's already true with incremental builds, but with deferred static generation, what happens is you can mark a page for deferred. And so let's say PSU case here, say you have a blog post that's 10 years old and like 3 people a year see it, right? So it takes the same amount of time to build that page as it takes to build your highest traffic page, right? It's still the same process in Gatsby. So you may say, well, I don't want to spend any build time on this subset of pages. Just build that page when someone actually needs it, which might be 3 months from now, right? So those pages are ignored from the build. Their data is still sourced, but they're not built. Their JavaScript isn't built. Their HTML isn't built, et cetera, which is their queries aren't run, which is a big part of the build process. So you really just kind of set these pages aside until a user asks for them. Then when the user asks for them, the Gatsby process runs for just that page. It's statically built. It's added to the like atomic deploy that was, we call them, of that Gatsby build. And then any user that requests it after that point just gets the static version. Looked up previews. You know, I would love to do a webinar like just on preview and all the stuff we've done the last year, but the idea is, as a content editor, you can share these URLs and say, hey, this is the Drupal component that I just filled all the fields in for. This is what this page is going to look like, you know, so and so. What do you think? We've also improved like the UI and the feedback so that the content editor in the preview pane has like a little floating widget that says, hey, here, these changes are building, or these changes are done, et cetera. So you can have a good idea of what's going on. And then this does use Gatsby hosting, which we haven't really talked about like deploy times, but you can imagine how many files there are for 66,000 pages, like just HTML files, you're at 66,000, and you got all the images, you've got all the JSON files, you got, hundreds of thousands of files. So we built a really amazing hosting platform where, I mean, nothing else compares because of the way we're able to store and move the files. So a typical deploy of a static site on other platforms is going to be pretty slow because you're going to have to move hundreds of thousands of files from one place to another. With Gatsby hosting, we've done some really creative, cool stuff where those files are either not moved or they're just like pointed to, and it goes incredibly fast relative to other solutions.
All right. We have a couple questions already lined up, but we do have a good 10 minutes, so feel free to enter in some more in there. And actually, this first question on our list, I think we actually connected to another one, but is the Drupal CMS self-hosted or hosted in the cloud behind a firewall? I think we covered this. It's at Acquia, right?
That's right. Yep.
All right. Well, coming off that then, I think there was a question. Yeah. Can you speak to the ongoing costs of the platform? Generic terms is fine. Like, doesn't have to be month to month, but Obviously now instead of like one system, you have kind of three. There's the Acquia running the Drupal, there's S3 holding images, and then there's Gatsby builds. Can you talk to a little bit about that, like strategy and process?
Quickly and at a very high unspecific level, we think of this as a platform, right? So moving all of this to the cloud, there's savings associated to that, labor, material, that's now not doing that work at Penn State, right? It's in the cloud. Penn State has a strategic relationship with Acquia where we're not all buying our own Acquia instances, we're sharing, so there's efficiencies gained there. I mean, Gatsby as a CDN, I'm not gonna, their price is their price, but it's predictable. And that's what that makes a lot of sense to us, that we can plan for it. And then being able to segregate the front end, that's our business stake in the ground. Like, we are insourcing that ultimately is our long-term plan. So being able to sort of segregate all of these the segments of the infrastructure and outsource stuff we need to outsource and insource the stuff we want to insource, ultimately it works out, but at this scale.
All right, perfect. All right, how does Gatsby work with, I think this is going to be for you, Jim or Mark, maybe about Drupal. How does Gatsby work with CSP headers and lock them down to specific domains for including scripts? Do you have to recompile the entire site to approve a domain for inclusion, i.e. a new ad campaign tracking script?
I can take this one, Shrop. So that does differ depending on your host, who you're hosting with, right? Because every host is gonna possibly want their headers file a little bit different, whether it's like a underscore headers.json or something else. But yes, Gatsby has they typically will have a plugin, like Netlify has a plugin, Gatsby Cloud has a plugin for how to generate that headers file, where you can say, okay, this we'll block this script on this domain, or allow these scripts on this domain. It's fully flexible. You can do whatever you like. As far as it recompiles the entire site, no, I wouldn't recompile the entire site. Again, Gatsby has a lot of built-in caching and a lot of smart things that it does. So yes, you would have to rebuild some of the site, but it wouldn't be anything close to a full build.
All right, next question. This is a Gatsby 3 question, so if it's solved with Gatsby 4, I think we can leave it there. But when we write a static query, the JSON file with data gets loaded on every page. Using separate templates or code splitting with loadable components does not change this. How can we make this more performant? And by avoiding static queries and writing the query in Gatsby Node.js and saving it to a JSON file instead? Question mark. There's also a little bit kind of a follow-on in general about like the JSON API core module versus the Gatsby source Drupal plugin. So I think if we can cover both of those.
I can talk about the static query aspect. So first of all, I don't want people to be too scared of page data.json files. Just the way the browser handles a JSON file is going to be a lot more efficient than a JS file, right? The way it has to parse it, but it doesn't have to execute it, right? So it is some kilobytes over the wire, but it's not something to be super concerned about. And I'd have to see the code itself. There's a lot of patterns that can cause something to end up on every page. Sometimes Gatsby makes the decision that something should be on every page because it's used on enough pages that it makes more sense to just load it once and never have to load it again. So there's kind of a lot of things there. There's also just like the mental cost of like, if the code makes sense, and again, it's not causing a huge performance impact, you can block that JSON file from loading in the browser and retest it and see if it's like actually causing a big impact. I doubt that a page data.json is going to be causing a huge impact in your performance. And if it means your developers are able to reason about the code and work with the code efficiently, I probably wouldn't stress about it. Long-term Gatsby 4 stuff, static query, you're probably going to see some improvements on this. The way queries work and are like parsed and identified and stuff with Gatsby, but yeah.
All right, next question. I'm going to kind of, again, morph a couple questions and make this maybe a little bit more technical, but there seems to be a a few questions around kind of how many nodes you had, but also how any patterns or techniques you use to really optimize that. And then there were a few questions around just like on top of that, how long were the build times when you got finished? How long are the incremental build times like in the real world settings?
I don't know, Jim, do you have a range that you're seeing now on production that
Preview under 30 seconds, publish, 2 to 3 minutes, and then a build with under a minute or so, which is, that's the sweet spot. That's what we need it to be.
All right. And then for sourcing and optimizing like those endpoints, was there anything special that helped really, I guess, like get those 66,000 pages to be able to work like that, aside from just like out of the box source plugins today?
lots of improvements and work done on the Gatsby side, I would say, for some of those community modules and plugins. Yeah, like this pushed everything. It's like Grayson was talking about. This project pushed all kinds of things at scale, and those improvements were realized. It still amazes me looking back how far it's come, because the build times were not near what Jim was quoting earlier on. They went up and down, and then as new things were solved. And frankly, it's just problems you would not see on most Gatsby sites because they just don't source that much content. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, and I think the Drupal plugin and the Drupal ecosystem really benefited from this entire experience. Like
100%.
we run a couple webinars, and there's always kind of been a Drupal community that has suffered through maybe unreliable like previews or slow previews, and I think that this has been like a testament to how much improvement has been done. All right, there's a couple questions on CDNs as well. And if you can run a, let's say, like a WAF in front of the CDN, maybe like Cloudflare rules or Akamai rules. Did you look at that at all? Grayson, do you come across that as well, dealing with customers that want to run that? And if so, what is the performance like hit there if they put something in between?
Yeah, I mean, we see it sometimes of, so we partner with Fastly. Fastly is who powers Gatsby hosting and Gatsby CDN. So there are, of course, configurations that you can do through that integration, but there are times where somebody has like another layer in front. It's hard to say what the performance implications are. I haven't heard any complaints. I guess I'll put it that way. But yeah, I mean, technically you can put whatever you want in front of it. We often ask, like, what are you trying to do? Because, we would love to solve that problem for you, but then of course you're free to do that kind of stuff technically. But yeah, not super common, and haven't heard any complaints about performance.
This last one is a pretty good question. Actually, two. What made the choice of Drupal handling your images with the S3 bucket instead of Gatsby's image plugin? I actually think we've talked about this a bit internally.
Yeah. Grayson, you kind of predicted that question, I think, coming up. I mean, for us, one of the pieces is just the sheer amount of images that were involved there. And I know, Grayson, you had some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, so typically you're going to see eventually someone will abandon the image plugin when it starts to eat up too much of their build time. We have started an initiative in the last year where certain source plugins and the CMS work together to do the image transformations, like when you upload the image to the CMS, essentially. And then as part of the API response, the image data is in the shape that the plugin needs, so that when you query, for a Gatsby image, you have to query certain fields. Like it used to be fluid or fixed, and now it's, image data or whatever the shape is, right? It's got to have a source set and all these things, right? So the idea is we're doing this for as many as possible. Just, take some work of having the source plugin and the CMS in question handle that at a different time. Right now, Drupal does not do that. Contentful and Shopify are examples of ones that do. You can just query Gatsby image data without actually seeing those transformations happen in the build process because it's happening elsewhere. That's on the roadmap for Drupal to make those images do that, and then you wouldn't have to worry about that like eating up, build resources like that. But yeah, that would not be feasible for the amount of images that they have with the Drupal plugin at the moment.
All right. Last two questions. I'm going to combine them as well. It's around authentication. How does Gatsby Drupal handle security if external user has to be authenticated, not an internal publisher? I don't know if y'all have that use case today, but Grayson, maybe you want to cover how authentication can be handled with Gatsby.
Yeah, I'll talk about the Gatsby, the plugin side, and then there's Shrop can talk about I think there's Drupal modules you can use for even more control. But essentially, the plugin just takes, auth credentials, right? So you create a user that has like JSON API read permissions, and otherwise that stuff is hidden. And so it goes in as an environment variable with the plugin with the API request, so that Drupal knows that it's okay to open up JSON API to that user.
Yeah, that's right. And again, like from a content editor experience, we're using SAML and SSO with Penn State's Active Directory through Azure for that type of authentication. But yeah, it's pretty standard. API keys, or there's a corresponding Drupal user on the Drupal side handling those API requests. So yeah.
And if there was something like a login as a content reader that you wanted to have like favorite articles, you could handle that like via function as well, Grayson, right? Or I mean, theoretically, you can also SSR, but like you can think about Drupal as a CMS, and then you can have a whole nother admin system basically on the front end that is for like your users.
Yeah, so you could have a Gatsby function, which is Gatsby's flavor of serverless functions that makes like a runtime call for maybe some content that's supposed to be gated or something. And yeah, I mean, lots of options.
All right. I think there's a couple more. So anything that we don't cover too, we'll nail on Twitter. We can all reach out. The last one that I think I wanted to get to that we didn't, with DSG, can you set a timeout before you regenerate again, a little like a TTL and the cache? I think this is actually just like different, right, Grayson? So with DSG, you would only incrementally, or you'd only build what was updated. And then if it wasn't updated, it would be available upon first request. And then once that request was there, it's already in your atomic static build. So as soon as that gets hit one time, yeah, you can go.
Yeah, so it's kind of like two different schools of thought about caching, right? One is time-based cache, and then one is Gatsby's is more like data-based caching. So but what you're talking about would be more like ISR, which is like Next.js's flavor of this, which is you set a time on that page is when to rebuild. The biggest problem with that is going to be stale content, right? Like you set a time, and then that time is your best guess, right? But we all know caching is hard, and so then someone might go there at a time when it's been updated, but the time hasn't updated, so they're getting stale content. The idea of DSG is that it's like a database caching. So when and that's data based, not database. So like if this blog post has been updated, then they'll get the freshest version. So then again, you can always set headers to whatever you want. So if you want to put that on there, you can use one of the header plugins to do that. But it's just kind of a different way of thinking about it altogether.
Whoops, muted. There's a question on web forms as well. How are web forms handled? I know we have a few examples with functions, but Jim and Mark, do you have any web forms on your site today that you use?
So that wasn't a requirement of this build. So but can't speak to
The
it
first web
specifically.
project ever. Sounds amazing.
I can
all right,
I can
last one.
envision
Yeah, go for it,
functions.
Mark.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I can envision functions like Grayson brought up, helping with that. That's commonly used for web forms on projects like
Yeah,
this.
I think web form there is like alluding to like Drupal web forms. So I think people have done that with Gatsby sites that I've seen, but I think most people will probably lean to some kind of other JavaScript, React-based solution. So like, yeah, Gatsby functions, the Lambda function, something like that is what people would most likely use.
That's the way I would encourage.
I like it, Jim.
All right. This, I promise, actually will be the last question. Mark's got just a follow up on the DSG. So with DSG, if I update the data back in the blog post and the previously generated static version is invalidated.
Yes, that's it.
Correct. And then as soon as it is requested one time by the end user, it's then put in the cache layer with everything else, and it behaves exactly like a static site for every single person but the first request.
Yep.
All right. Jim, Mark, I definitely want to thank you. I appreciate y'all coming out with us today and showing the power of Gatsby and decoupled Drupal.
Thanks for
Thanks
having
for
me.
having us.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for coming.
No problem. Grayson, thank you as
Thank you.
always for joining us as well. Thanks for coming out today. If you have any other questions, we will get to them on Twitter and keep this conversation going in the public.
Thanks,
All right,
man.
y'all have a good one.